hopefully you will have got some idea on what we mean by paradigm and the importance of paradigm from my conversation with Mark. But this is an area where a lot of people do get a bit confused because there's some jargon and terminology that might not be familiar to everybody. Now, let's start with an assumption that as human beings we live in the world and we try to make sense of that world. And when we talk about research, as you may remember in the early part of the series, that research is about systematic inquiry to build useful knowledge. But this has to be done, as the term implies, in some systematic way that makes certain assumptions about the nature of reality, about how we can conduct research and the methodologies involved. So that's essentially the paradigm question. So I'm going to go through this, hopefully nice and clear, and you can digest it and we can see where we go from there. So essentially, for those who want to go deep and backwards, Thomas Kuhn, famous writer who coined it, and he talks about research communities that share a particular view about the world. And when we have a view about the world, we're making assumptions about aspects of reality. And invariably, the most basic question is, what is the nature of reality? Is there a real world that is tangible, that is fully understandable? What we often call objective reality. We talk about objectivity in our everyday conversation. What that means is the ability to frame what's really going on, a little bit like the X-Files. The truth is out there, but sadly we can only experience it through our senses. So that's one aspect of paradigms. What assumptions are being made about the nature of reality? And secondly, what's the relationship between us, the researcher, and that reality? In other words, do we influence that reality? Or are we separate from it? Can we be separate from it? Can we be value-free? Or does our very senses and the way we interact with people shape the reality itself? So in a sense, it's not out there, we are part of it, we are constructing it. And that's often referred to as epistemological questions, and the previous one's ontological questions. But don't get too tied up with that, providing you understand the essential concepts involved. What is reality? How do we know it? And what kind of relationship can we have with it? Can we be detached, or do we inevitably influence it? And finally, out of that will come the methodological questions. Given these assumptions about reality and their relation to it, what methods are most useful, most valid about understanding that reality? So I've had a good go there at trying to make it understandable. He says, hopefully. Okay, so in the absolute sense, we can't prove or disprove any of these paradigms, because if we could, we wouldn't be discussing different paradigms. There would be a paradigm for research. So you have to do a bit of thinking about this in relation to your research and make certain decisions. There's three main paradigms generally documented, though sometimes they get different names and terminology, but you'll get the main gist from the next few slides. So stay with it, it won't be that long. Okay, one is your traditional scientific method, often referred to as a positive paradigm, and it essentially makes an assumption that there is an external world, there is a real world out there, and it's driven by certain laws, the laws of physics, etc. Your Einsteinian physics, Newtonian physics, etc. And the basic challenge for us as researchers is to discover that reality and to frame it in objective terms, so it becomes fact rather than opinion. And as a researcher, our challenge is to be objective, bias-free. We don't look at that reality with a intention of putting our own frame on it, looking for stuff that supports our beliefs or our views. So we should have a methodology that systematically reduces bias. And that's why we set up controlled experiments and things like that. And finally, the methods are very much the methods of the natural science, which is the experimental method under controlled conditions. And the argument was that we can apply this, and it certainly was well believed many decades ago, that the same methods of the natural sciences could be applied to social sciences. So that's the positivist paradigm. Now, eventually that got severely challenged, and it got challenged on the assumption that human beings are not like physical matter. Physical matter doesn't have consciousness, it doesn't respond to the investigator. In other words, if you boil water, it doesn't say, well, I don't want to boil at 100 degrees centigrade. Whereas with human beings, because we interpret the world and we make decisions, that our behaviour doesn't follow the same cause and effect principles. So with positivist paradigm, it tries to retain the essential aspects of positivism, but accepts that human cognition, the way the mind works, is inherently flawed and subjective, which means it will create its own internal reality. Now, in terms of the relationship between the researcher and the subject, it cannot be value-free, because the researcher will influence the behaviour of the subjects, and how the subjects or participants or people being researched respond to the researcher. Again, is based on their perception and their interpretation. But we try to be as objective as possible. So objectivity remains a regulatory ideal, but it can never be attained in social research, of which educational research is part of that. Hence, we can use a number of methods. Yeah, the scientific traditional experimental method has been used and is still used in part, but we are starting to recognise other more qualitative methods where we try to understand how people are perceiving, feeling, the meanings they give to things are equally, if not more important. And finally, if we're moving along this continuum from the traditional scientific method, the interpretive, constructivist, sometimes called phenomenological paradigm, is moving even further away from the idea of there being an external world that we can study, that there is some real basis for objectivity, and takes a view, if we go through the same process of ontology, epistemology and methodology, that reality isn't separate from individual consciousness. And therefore we have multiple realities as socially produced, individualised, and essentially can be constantly changing. So we're always dealing with the subjectivity of individuals and the intersubjectivity between individuals. So when we do research, we've got to recognise that what we find is always socially and situationally produced, and therefore the capability to generalise is always limited. So that makes our research almost like the collection of stories narration, and we try to make certain inferences, interpretations, but making generalised statements becomes much more problematic in this paradigm. So the researcher cannot be detached, and it's essentially a meaning-making situation. So knowledge is derived from, in social research, is inevitably socially produced by the particular situated context of the research encounter. So this takes a little bit of thinking and digesting, but look at the paradigms in terms of those key assumptions and do some comparison and contrast, and you should get there with a little bit of thinking. Hence, the methods are moving very much away from the experimental method, and it's much more qualitative. So we recognise there will be interactions, and those interactions are natural, and we need to make our methodology much more flexible and fluent over time. Participant observation, in-depth interviewing, to try to describe, to make meaning of people's perceptions, and to understand those individual constructions of reality. And so finally, just as a summary to those paradigms, the big issue is always one of how objective we can be in social research. That from a positivistic position, the idea was, yes, we can, the truth is out there. From a constructivist point of view, we are only making situated constructions, framing of reality. So here's a couple of statements to reflect on. And this is a little bit post-positivist, as I see it, that reality is something out there in the real world. There is something out there. It's not totally all subjective, but there's also our own construction. So when we do research, we want to try to capture what's out there and also what's in people's minds, and we try to make sense of that to come up with useful understandings. And the final one is, that ultimately, as social researchers, educational researchers, the idea that we can ever really be value-free and do positivist type research in an educational setting is not really viable. So it's about good qualitative research methodology, which we will be looking at fairly extensively over this series. Hope that wasn't too complex. So replay it, think about it, and we will get there.